But before we do that, quickly, a few housekeeping notes. One thing to know about this show, it's not a webinar, it's just our GovCon Coffee and Issues show that we do here live, both in a video format, but we also turn that into a podcast. But after the show, we're going to break and we're going to take some Q&A issues from those of you guys who have joined us live. So if you're watching us on live stream and you want to join us live to be a part of the Q&A, please go to govology.com/issues, and there's a little button that you can use to register for today's show and come on in and hang out with us. So we are also going to be posting those back on that webpage. So any of our past issues, you can also see those there at govology.com/issues. We're also going to be posting the video on our YouTube channel. You can find us on Facebook at Govology USA. We're on Anchor FM with the podcast and platform and Spotify. And then last but not least, I want to talk about Govology Nation. That's our private LinkedIn community. So if you're not already a part of Govology Nation, I invite you to join us there. Best link is just go to govology.com/nation. And also you'll have a little link there. It's federal-access.com/Govology. And my co-host Michael Lejeune has put that together for those of you guys who want to come in and get a few great resources that they have coordinated over there for you. So thank you guys all for joining us. And I'm going to stop my screen share for a second here and we'll go ahead and get started. All righty. And quick check, Elena, did you do the pin for everybody? For Michael and Nicole and myself?
Hold on just a second.
Okay.
Just a minute. I'm gonna pin and Nicole and Carol. Where are you?
I can, let's see.
Can you pin yourself?
I can pin myself.
Okay.
Can you find Michael?
I found Michael.
All right.
I pinned Michael and Nicole, so we're all good.
All right. I don't see Michael on the screen, on my screen. Let me see.
Like I'm pinned in the middle on mine. So it depends on what, if you're looking at speaker versus gallery.
Okay. And I might actually be looking in the wrong spot. Anyway, so here we go. All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Coffee and Issues. I'm joined by my regular co-host, Mr. Michael Lejeune here. Hey, Michael.
Hey, how's it going, man?
We're doing great, man. And thank you for joining us again, waking up, getting up out the bed today to come and take part in some good GovCon conversations.
It's sort of late in the day here. It's noon, so.
Yeah. And I'm excited this week as well to join us is Nicole Potroff from the law firm of Prince McCall Potroff LLC, and she's our guru. And I wanted to invite Nicole today because the topic that we're going to be talking about is issues with being the middleman. And so there's some problems that you might run into depending upon how you're looking to structure your business in GovCon. There's certainly a lot of folks that, participate as resellers, value-added resellers, and prime contractors that work as integrators with other subcontractors. So there's certainly a lot of what you can consider the middleman. But what you really want to avoid and be careful of, and we actually had this week was an issue submitted on to our platform at govology.com/issues about topics associated with being the middleman. And so I think what we want to really be careful of is that you don't want to be a small business just thinking that you're going to come in here, leverage your small business set aside to kind of like broker deals or be a middleman where you're just going to say, hey, I'm going to get the opportunity, but we're going to pretty much let the subcontractor perform all the work. And we're just going to, collect a little bit of a royalty on that. That really doesn't work. That's called a pass through. And so this is what we're going to talk about today is like how you can actually be somewhat of a middleman if you are a reseller or in any of those other aspects, but it's also what to understand and avoid when it comes to the rules of playing that game. But also Michael and Nicole, there's some other elements that come into play. I have a little tip that I'll talk about one consideration that might cause issues outside of the legal perspective for small business set-asides. But I know you guys as well have seen this a lot. So Nicole, thank you for joining us and taking some time today to share some of your legal perspectives and insights. And I want to give a little disclaimer on behalf of Nicole, because this is not a forum for legal advice, but what she's going to simply help us do is understand the breakdown of some of the laws. They've been doing a lot of blogging lately about some of these regulations that we're going to be talking about. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'll start with you, Nicole. And, one of the biggest things I see propping up as an issue from the get-go with a small business wanting to participate in small business set-asides and looking at this idea of just being like the broker or the middleman is that they're not really seeing some of the regulations that apply to small business set-asides in the context of things like the non-manufacturer's rule, things like limitations on subcontracting, and things like ostensible subcontracting, which is related somewhat. But maybe you could talk about some of those specific three things, how those might impact a small business. And I know we could do probably a whole webinar on each of those ones, but just like a quick breakdown on why these regulations produce these challenges that small businesses need to really understand in terms of trying to do it the right way.
Yeah, and I'll keep it real big picture and then we can kind of go into more specifics on it. But generally, anytime you've got a contract that's set aside for small business or one of those other socioeconomic statuses, so 8A, WOSB, SDVOSB, Hub Zone, you will have limitations on how much work needs to actually be done by the qualifying entity. So the entity that qualifies for the work being the prime contractor here, obviously the prime would have to be the one that qualifies to get the award. Then the question becomes, how much of that work can I basically rely on other people for? How much do I have to do? How much do I have to have here? And when you talk about services contracts, you generally talk about, sorry, I got some kind of feedback there. Nope. Okay. When you talk about services contracts, you generally are talking about the limitation on subcontracting. So that's going to be for general services contracts, a 50% limitation, specialty trade, construction, there's different kinds. They have different limitations. 50 is about as tight as it gets. Other than that, you usually have a little more leniency on how little the prime can do. But essentially, usually the contract itself or the solicitation itself will say FAR, 52. Oh, I can't tell you off the top of my head. It's one of those FAR clauses that is a limitation on subcontracting. We always went off the SBA one because the FAR one, frankly, was a mess for years and years and years and just finally got updated. But I will figure out what exactly that was. But basically, it's going to have the clause in there most of the time. And if it doesn't, that's a great time to reach out to your CO. Even before you get the contract, even just bidding and say, hey, I just wanted to clarify which limitations on subcontracting apply to this contract. It is FAR 52.21914. So this does now parrot directly the SBA one, which is 125.6. And so it gives you limitations. As the prime that qualifies for this work, you have to do a certain amount of the work. And I guess one of the big misconceptions a lot of people have is that you have to self-perform that amount of the work. And that's not necessarily the case. Under the old FAR rule it was, but the new FAR rule and the SBA rule both talk about these similarly situated entities. So in a nutshell, if you've got a small business set-aside contract and you've got some small business subcontractors and some large business subcontractors, any work that's going to a small business can kind of count in that pool of that small business subcontracting and small business self-performing work that has to be at least 50%. And so then you can kind of do what you want with the other 50%. So in a very, very big picture nutshell of that, that's kind of how that works. When you get into mixed contracts and supplies contracts, that's when you start really having more questions on what's going to apply, whether it's limitations on subcontracting, whether we're doing a supplies NAICS code, where then you would either need to be the manufacturer itself, which clearly isn't going to be the subject of today because we're talking about kind of middleman. So then there's this non-manufacturer rule that you would need to comply with if you are not the manufacturer. And we can probably get into more details of that shortly, but in a nutshell, the non-manufacturer rule is kind of an approach with a couple prongs to it that basically says the business that's not manufacturing the work can qualify as this non-manufacturer if they themselves do not exceed the 50%, the 500 employee size standard. So it's an employee size standard, not a annual receipts based one, like the limitation on subcontracting is typically going to look at when it's determining whether you're a small or similarly situated entity under that contract. This one's going to look at employees. So size standard of the actual non-manufacturer will need to be 500 or less. You will need to be primarily engaged in the retail or wholesale of the items that normally selling that type of product being supplied. That's usually demonstrated by showing tax returns, finances, pointing to these type of sales being something that is standard for that business. And then you need to take ownership or possession of the item with your personnel, your equipment, or your facilities. There's a whole plethora of case law out there about what take ownership means and exactly what qualifies and what doesn't. I'm sure we'll get into some of the more nuances as we go here, but I'm trying to keep it big picture for now, because exactly as Carol said, I could probably do a different webinar in each one of these topics, and we don't have time for that today. And then the final one is that you supply the end product of a small business manufacturer, processor in the United States, or you have a waiver. There's a couple kinds of waivers. There's a class waiver, and then there's a contract specific waiver that says, look, for this contract, we're going to waive this fourth bullet, this fourth element. Or there's also a class waiver that says, look, generally there's not small businesses that provide this. That's things often like airline travel, other things. I can't think of many off the top of my head, but other things that just small businesses don't typically do. So it's okay to say, look, we do have to provide something from a large business here. We can't do this small business situated in the US. But keep in mind, that's the only one of the 4 factors that can be waived. So all of those other ones would need to be met. Typically, you're looking at limitation on subcontracting or non-manufacturer rule, or you are the manufacturer. But for purposes of today as the middleman, you're definitely going to be looking at those other 2 generally. So I'll kind of do that as big picture for now. I briefly mentioned ostensible subcontractor rule, which is definitely a rule that is not a limitation on subcontracting rule per se. It is actually an affiliation rule. So what that does is if you were to have a small business prime get this award, but the small business prime starts just handing out massive amounts of the important parts of the contracts, the primary and vital parts of the contract to a large sub. And it starts kind of being unduly reliant on that sub. So it could not perform. This sub quit, they'd be in trouble, big trouble. So that's kind of the other part there you have to keep in mind. So while that is an affiliation rule, it's contract specific affiliation. So if you are deemed by SBA to have an ostensible subcontractor, you don't have to panic that that's going to be forever and ever your affiliate. It's your affiliate for the contract at hand. So if you both add your sizes together and you still don't meet that size standard, then you can lose an award, lose a contract, and there can actually be other consequences. Some of the rule updates talk about those as well. But just recently, we've had a really good rule update that's going to clarify things a bit in our many times defending against the ostensible subcontractor allegations that our clients have gotten. We've said, look, we're complying with the limitation on subcontracting. So shouldn't that be a defense here? I mean, if we're only contracting out 50%, I would say there's at least some argument there that that's not probably going to be all of the primary and vital work that you need to do. So the good news is SBA has recently issued some rules that do make that a defense. And one of the exceptions is construction contracts, because you can't do a construction contract and go ahead and meet that limitation on subcontracting, which actually only requires you to do 15% of the work. But that one specifically talks about the type of work that the SBA believes is primary and vital. Right. And it's supervising, managing, controlling subcontractors. So that is one exception in this new rule that's coming out. It does say, even if you meet the limitation on subcontracting for that one, you could still potentially violate the primary and vital. And again, I think that's kind of two-pronged. One, because that's such a small percentage, you only have to do 15. And two, because we know what that primary and vital work is. And so we want to make sure that's not going out. Whereas for services contracts, generally, there's a whole analysis you have to do to figure out what that primary and vital work is. So that's big picture on those three kind of really big topics we could do whole webinars on, and then turn it back to Carol and we can go into more details on some of those aspects.
Yeah, that was great. Take recap on all of those things. I don't want to go to Michael here, but I want to just we'll say we're going to come back to a few of these things. I want to talk about a little bit of the specifics. But Michael, what do you see when it comes to, folks that are coming into the marketplace? I mean, either with some of the regulations or even maybe other issues that might crop up that might present issues and challenges to them being able to, get the contracts.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I see that's a really big problem, and I don't really know where this originated, but and maybe it started somewhere around COVID, maybe a little bit before, but there's been a lot of a surge of people that kind of do what you and I do, that only want to talk about the middleman. And excuse me, the focus has been selling a course or something to people who are brand new to government contracting. I would say it's the people that almost can't spell government contract. Like, you're so brand new that you don't know what you don't know. And there's a lot of these people out there, in my opinion, this is just Mike's opinion, kind of preying on these people that are brand new, trying to get into the market and saying, go buy my course. I'll show you how to be a middleman. You don't need a product. You don't need a service. You don't need a staff. You can do this from your home. You don't need a credit line. It's so easy to sell to the government. The government is, trying to sell stuff to minority-owned companies, status companies, and they're in such a need that this is going to be a home run for you. If you just go buy my course, that's $900, $1,500, whatever dollars, I'm going to teach you how to make millions of dollars in your underwear right from your bedroom with just a laptop and a cell phone. I'm not exaggerating when I throw that out there as the pitch. I mean, that is the pitch I'm seeing. And there's dozens that I know of. And every week I hear of more of these people that I've never heard of before. I'm like, I've never heard of this person. And they're selling the course on this because somebody will reach out. Hey, do you know Bob Smith over in whatever? I'm like, never heard of him. Show me the website. And I'm like, oh, it's another middleman strategy trying to do this. And so the middleman strategy does work. I'll say that, with a lot of caveats, right? And Nicole talked about a bunch of the rules and regulations and those kind of things, which they don't really talk about in the advertising or marketing of these middleman programs that are out there. You'll learn it the hard way once you get in, but it's not in the marketing, because if they told you, hey, there's all these rules you got to comply with, you probably wouldn't drop $1,500 on their course, right? So that's the first thing that I really want people to understand, is to be extremely wary of this as a core business model that you're being pitched. That's the first thing, because it's not a core business model. Right. It's just not. It may get some people into the market, but again, it's one of those things where when people approach me, I'm like, well, it depends.
Yeah.
And the second thing that I see for a lot of people is they're like, well, what should I sell? And they're starting to look at things and I'm like, well, what do you know? Because if you've never been a business owner and you've never done business with the government, you have two uphill battles out of the gate: how to be a business owner, how to sell to the government. You're going to throw a third one in of trying to learn a product that you've never heard of. Like, I don't know anything about, engines and engine parts and all that, but I heard the government buys a lot of that, so I want to sell that. Like, do you have a background in it? Nope. Okay, well, this is going to be difficult for you, right? So I always, when somebody comes to me, I just had a guy the other day. He was like, man, I really want to do this. We're currently, they have an arborist business, so they do a lot of tree work and things like that. He's like, but I want to sell engine parts. Like, why? Why are you choosing that? And he was one of the few people that actually had a background. He was like, when I've been coming up over the years, I know ins and outs of all these stuff. I know the manufacturers. I know those kind of things. I'm like, okay, well, then you can go down that route. But if you told me something you don't know, then I'm going to be like, man, you got 3 strikes against you. This is going to be really difficult. So when you're coming into this market and the middleman is your strategy, I always tell people, go with a product you understand or a service you understand. If you're a general contractor today, like Nicole was talking about on the contracting side, that's a strategy where you can be somewhat the middleman, right? But you need to do things that you understand because, again, it's an uphill battle for people who are brand new and don't know any of that type of stuff. If you've been in the market and you're more of a well-established business and you're trying to add this to your business, you're most likely going to do it as a VAR, a value-added reseller. And the thing I always say is you got to bring the V to this game, because a lot of people don't bring the value add. Yeah. They just want to say, I just want to sell the product. I just want to sell well, what value are you adding? Because if you're not adding value, then the challenge is going to be, well, how many people sell Salesforce licenses or SAP licenses or, Microsoft licenses? Well, there's thousands, maybe tens of thousands. So what's the value you provide, why they would buy from you, and figuring that type of stuff out. So it's not as clear cut and dry as a lot of these courses out there make it out to be. And you've got to think through this a little bit more. And then you've got to deal with, regulations, restrictions, all those kind of things. So that's my cautionary tale out of the gate here, is to just be wary of the model and understand it's not a core business model for most folks. It's just not, because the other downside, even if you are a VAR, the government wants a big discount. So guess what? Even if you're selling $100,000 worth of product, you might make 6 or 8%. Then you've got credit card fees if you have credit card fees. So can you live on $6,000? Probably not. So how many of those contracts do you have to win to actually make a living? A lot of them. Even if you're doing $1 million in sales, it's a decent income, but it's $1 million in sales. And right. So that may be 10, 12, 15 contracts for you to win. So just thinking through those types of things is what I always caution people when they're talking middleman, profitability, knowing the product or service you're trying to sell. Those are just some of probably my opening, thoughts around it. So,
man, thank you. You've hit a lot of nails right on the head, and I'll share a story that relates exactly to what you were saying, Michael. And not a lot of people know this, but before we launched Scavology, I used to like to play the guinea pig, and I used to look at these things that were, people were saying out there about do this, do that. And we actually, for about a year, we were kind of doing some construction things, and we were, the majority of what we were selling, we were doing some construction supply sales, and having kind of knowing all of these rules and trying to bake them into everything, it made it challenging from a number of aspects. One aspect was one of the things that Nicole brought up earlier, with this notion of you having to take possession of the material with your personnel, property, ownership, etc. Right? So then I started saying, well, a lot of resellers are just really kind of drop shipping from the manufacturer to the end user. And how do we actually get this done, legally? And can we say, hey, if we basically take possession virtually by putting insurance when it leaves the destination, and we kind of own it in transit and it gets to the other side, does that comply with the non-manufacturer's rule and all of that stuff? By the way, for those of you guys who are resellers, if you don't have the manufacturer NAICS codes built into your profiles, you're going to want to have those, even if you're not the manufacturers, because that's kind of the essence of the non-manufacturer's rule in a weird way. And mostly the government will buy even from the resellers through the manufacturer's NAICS codes. So that's one little tip. But let me kind of continue my story, and I'll make it as quickly as shortly as possible. But before I do that, Mike, one thing that you said that's really rings true is you see all these pop up gurus who's like, hey, just do this, and you make millions of dollars like I did. When I see that, there's a couple of things that I think about. Number one, I know that because every contractor's journey is a little bit differently, whatever that person was selling might be different than what you sell. And you need to understand the rules and regulations around what you sell not necessarily around what somebody else sells. I will also say this, even if they did make, a couple $1 million or $1 million in sales selling to the government for a short period of time, where are they now? Are they still selling to the government? Did they do it right? I mean, if you look at the story of War Dogs, which I know a lot of people have seen the movie, I recommend actually listening to the audiobook if you ever want to really hear something very intriguing. But you could get a person like that come out and be like, hey, I sold hundreds of millions of dollars to the government. Let me tell you how I did it. Doesn't mean that they did it right, And so, but as we did this for a year, we made about 300,000 in sales. But, what I realized is kind of like the back and forth. And you also, not only that, but you have to make sure that you're flowing down the appropriate regulations to your contractors and your suppliers, right? Both in an official RFQ, so they can give you the right pricing. If it says that you've got to get your product over, if it's coming from overseas on a US flagged vessel, that needs to be carried down to those subs that ultimately is going to be part of the whole equation, so you can meet your compliance and the whole 9 yards. But what you said rings very true with, hey, at the end of the day, if you make 5 or 6%, yeah, I mean, on $1 million of sales, but what a lot of folks don't account for is that 5 or 6% is not profit. You got to take out also all the time you spent that entire year talking with suppliers, doing the work, building the RFQs back and forth, and all of your time invested. So you need to take that part out. And then what are you left over with? And so that's one of the other issues. Is if you're selling kind of like a commodity type of item, like everybody else is selling, you're probably going to be squeezed and pinched, if you're not selling like massively, like millions and millions of dollars every year. So, those are the few things that I had run into. And I was like, this is not really worth it to do all of this work to basically actually sell for this percentage. And in fact, one of the distributors that we were working with, we ultimately said, look, why don't we just become like kind of like a manufacturer's rep for you, which a manufacturer's rep is like, okay, I'm not leveraging my certification to make the sale, but I've got knowledge and I'll just help you guys get the sales. Because at the end of the day, you're basically working for a commission anyway out of it, And so I'd rather actually have, if it's not set aside or, for a particular entity, I can use my knowledge to help a company get sales and make a little commission off of that, rather than have to do all of the work, because now they're accountable. They've got to deal with the government at the prime contract level. And so that's a strategy that I've talked to some folks about, is that maybe you consider setting up something where, yes, if it does go set aside, you can do that as a set aside and you understand the rules. By the way, I would encourage everybody, if you don't have a good GovCon attorney and you want to play this game, reach out to Nicole and have a conversation to understand, like, what is it you actually sell, so they can help you really build a compliance plan around those sales. And that's super important.
Yeah.
So
you brought up a couple of really good ones there, Carol. The drop shipping one is a pet peeve of mine for all these folks, because they think they can just drop ship. I have a quick story on that one. I had a client who sold plumbing parts through a third party. The government ordered like $60,000 worth of plumbing parts. And what it was really about 60,000 $1 parts. And so, and they drop shipped it to the customer, and then the customer went dark, and they're like, why haven't they accepted the shipment? What's going on?
I know where this is going.
Yeah, we're 30, 60, 90 days. Yeah, you probably heard this. We're 90 days out, can't get paid. And finally, somebody gets a hold of the customer, and they're like, can we come down there? Because we see it's in your warehouse, and like, it's not in the warehouse. They show up. Sure enough, it's in the warehouse. It's in a far back corner because they wouldn't check it in because it wasn't labeled properly. Mm-hmm. They were supposed to have it because they didn't read the directions. Now, this is a directions problem, but because they had it drop shipped, they were just like, oh, I'm drop shipping it from there to there.
Right.
And they were supposed to have every single part, all 60,000, in its own bag with its own label. And so the government was basically, you can label it, we can send it back to your place, so you can pay for shipping, you can label it at your place,
Oh man.
or you can pay us to do it. And they had to come out of their pocket, so they lost all their profit plus money out of their pocket, because they're like, to pay to ship it to our office, 60,000 plumbing. Like, we can't afford that, right? So they didn't understand what was involved, and the manufacturer was not going to label it that way and drop ship it for them. So they had that problem. The other problem I find with, like, when you're doing stuff like this is, it's one thing when you have a really good, and this is the flip side, the positive side. It's one thing when you have a really good relationship with a manufacturer.
Yeah.
But the challenge I see for a lot of new middleman people, and this is the thing to be aware of, is they'll see an RFP and it's for something that they've never sold before. And they're like, oh, well, I'll just go get a relationship with a manufacturer. You're probably not going to get that squared away in time. You're probably not going to get financing from them. You're probably not going to really understand the products. You're not going to understand their process. There's so many things to just go, hey, I'm just going to start selling plumbing products on Monday. Like, there's a lot of work that goes into that, because what a challenge another client of ours had was the government came to them and they bought about $20,000 in power strips, which seems on the surface like a really simple transaction, right? So what happened was the power strips were back ordered. And so the manufacturer was drop shipping them as they became available. So out of that $20,000, it wound up being 36 shipments with different invoices. And because it took so long to deliver, the pricing actually changed in the client's favor. So, like, there was a few invoices that were 13 cents, $1.35 less than what it should have been. And you would think the government would be like, oh, cool, thumbs up. Instead, the government's mind just blows up, because they're like, this invoice doesn't match what we thought it was supposed to be.
Yep.
So they didn't want to reconcile the invoice and pay. And then you've got your internal staff doing 36 invoices for a $20,000 order, and because they didn't understand the process and stuff like that. So understanding how your manufacturers work, having a good relationship with them, it's key to making the middleman strategy work. When you don't have that and you're optimistic that, oh, I'll just go and do this, it's not going to work well. And you're probably not going to get the best pricing. So, if I have been working with a manufacturer for 10 years and you just show up Monday, who's getting the better price?
Right.
It's not you.
And then also who sells the more volume, because, it's like you got these relationships that are already established, plus they're your volume seller. So you're certainly not going to give the person that calls you up with no relationship the same volume price discount. So you're already going to be outcompeted right there on price.
Yeah. So you waste a lot of time chasing stuff you shouldn't be, because, again, hey, the middleman strategy, it's so easy making money in your underwear from home, right? It's so easy. And that's,
if it was so easy, Michael would be doing it.
Well, I mean, you're in the underwear anyway. So but it's the cautionary tale of, I'm not saying it doesn't work, but if you know all these things we're talking about, you can make sure to put the right, mechanisms in place so that you don't have those problems. Because that's the biggest thing for me, is I see people get in, or they've quit their job, or they're out of a job, and instead of looking for a job, they're trying to sell stuff to the government. The other thing about this is not understanding the customer very well. We had a client last year that they put out about a dozen quotes for a customer that came to them in a 30-day period and asked them to quote. And so they quoted roughly $2.5 million worth of product on these 12 orders. And I'm following up. And I'm like, man, what? Tell me what's going on with those. And 90 days go by, 120 days go by, almost 6 months go by. And the client says, we just got a note. They canceled everything. They're out of funding. So they canceled every one of those bids, all $2.5 million. Because again, they did not understand the customer and their process and how things work. So, I mean, they were spending their money, hey, we're going to win this. We think we got the best price. And then the government just cancels every single one because it was one client that had put all those out. So, so there's a lot of those little pitfalls that you don't think about when you're trying to do this. I'd say the last one to me is when you're being the middleman, you have almost zero control, right? So like if the manufacturer makes any sort of change or there's a volume issue or whatever, you have no control over that type of stuff to deliver to your customer. And that can affect you in a lot of different ways. When you are the manufacturer or when you're the service provider, you have control over what you're delivering and how you're delivering it, the quality standards, all these little things that are really, really important in a customer relationship. And so I really value those direct relationships versus the manufacturer. And I'll tell you, I said that was the last one. I have one more. I was the manufacturer at one point where we were a really small business. We were doing about $10 million a year. And at some point, when I got put into a senior position at this company, this was like 20 years ago, one of the first things I said was, we're going to cancel all VAR agreements because the previous owners of the company had set up, I call them drug deals, the way they had done it, these really bad drug deals where we were the manufacturer and we were getting maybe a 20% profit on our own product because the government had convinced these guys, you got to go through us. We're the big prime. The big names, you would know them if I said the big names, like you got to go through us to sell to the government because we hold the contracts. And one of the first decisions I made was we're going to cancel all of our agreements. And we're going to sell direct to the government. And it was a decision I made that no one outside the company had control over it. So any of those people that wanted to sell our product couldn't anymore. And again, it was one of those things where we shouldn't be the manufacturer making 20%. We should be making the bulk of the money there. So yeah, the control is a really big one. So I could talk about these all day. People know from the podcast, I'm not a huge fan of this strategy. I think there's too many dollar signs for people. But like I've said a couple of times, you can do it right if you are aware of the challenges and you build the right relationships and you understand, like everything else, it's going to take time. It's going to take time. To your point, you did it for a year and did 300,000 in revenue. That's pretty average, I would say, for a company just getting into this. So understanding it's not an overnight strategy. It takes a lot of time to build those relationships, put the pieces together. If you go into it with that, you'll be a lot more successful than most people. Because again, you're just aware of the facts. So I'll get off my soapbox. So.
No, thank you, Michael, and we'll turn back to Nicole here. But I did want to say too, there are case studies that of companies that have done this successful. I'll just name a couple right here off the top of my head. Atlantic Dive Supply. If you ever want to look at those folks, they started out as a dive supply company. Now they sell like almost everything, but they've got their processes down. They understand the compliance elements. They understand, making sure their, manufacturers understand how they have to package it, how they have to invoice the government. By the way, always only invoice the government per order that you ship, because that's the way that they pay you. They go and look to see, hey, have we got the product? Yep. Here's the invoice. Here's what we ordered. Those three match and we can pay. But like Michael alluded to, is like if you start getting shipments with different invoices that, the person can't say, oh, yep, it's here. That's going to cause you some issues. Another company that was actually in my neck of the woods is a company called Howco, HOWCO. They actually did a lot of like military sales, but again, they've got, schedules, they've got their processes, they've got like whole teams of people that's all that they do all day is basically look at requirements from the government, reach out to their manufacturers. They actually have their own processing facility, which as one of the V's that they add with the value, it's like sometimes a lot of their manufacturers will ship their products to the Halco facility so that they can actually package it up into the standards that the military wants it in, then on ship it to them. So those are all things to consider. And again, Nicole, we'll turn it back to you, but And I know you guys have probably seen a lot and had, a lot of stories both on the successes and on the failures of this as well. So what is your kind of final thoughts as we look at this, and then we'll kind of cut it and we'll take the Q&As, but
Yeah.
what is your kind of Jerry Springer final thoughts here?
I love it. Yeah, Michael definitely brought up a couple of things that oh yeah, great point. And I've got a little to add. One of the big things I would say when you are newer to being kind of the middleman to things, I highly advise not necessarily just trusting your larger business subs, your larger business manufacturing companies. I cannot tell you how many clients have come to me and said, thanks for the 8A program help. We're in, we're so happy. So now this large company wants us to get these contracts and give them all the work. So if you can just help us do that. And okay, well, no matter what they're telling you here, that's not going to work. You would also be the one on the hook as the prime, not them. So one of the biggest, I think, takeaways, pieces of advice, and Michael definitely touched on this too, is find somebody that has no ulterior motive to really fill you in on the details, to look at your specific situation. I talked a little about the different kinds of limitations on subcontracting and the different kinds of how you could have a manufacturer rule here apply. You could have a non-manufacturer rule here apply. You really need someone to take a look at your contract, what NAICS code it uses, and when you get into things like mixed contracts, it gets more complicated. You divide up the contract into supplies and services, and whichever is more is typically the rule you have to follow. All of it gets very complicated. And you may be thinking, well, I've got this wonderful large business sub I've worked with for a while. They're super nice. They're telling me that this is all going to be okay. They're not the ones that are going to be in massive amounts of trouble if it turns out you just make yourself a pass-through. So if you are newer, if you don't know the rules, absolutely educate yourself. And that if you're just insistent that not be through an attorney, not my best plan, but if you're insistent, at least get out there and do some research, do the blogs, grab a handbook or two if you can find one. Shameless plug, we've got our size and affiliation handbook coming out really soon. So keep an eye on our blog if you want to know when that's released, but that talks about a lot of things regarding, how you need to be careful, what you're doing to make sure you stay in your size. It mentions limitations on subcontracting, non-manufacturer, all those things. But yeah, just really making sure you are educated. Don't take somebody's word for it that has a dog in the race, because they don't have a whole lot of motivation to tell you that you have to make sure you perform a certain amount. They want as much work as possible. They love getting the 8A, WOSB, small business work that they couldn't otherwise get. And I'm not saying they're even necessarily have bad intentions there, as much as they don't have the same motivations to make sure those rules are being followed that you do. So it is very important that you educate yourself and make sure you know what's going to apply to your contract. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway, kind of no matter what aspect of the conversation we're talking about. So
awesome. Well, three things I've got here. And one, education. We've got some great education on the Govology platform. I know Michael and Josh have also some great things at Federal Access if you guys want some education, and they've also got some great books. Get the education. Number two, I would say, is get yourself with an expert. I always advocate I know Michael don't like the word mastermind, but I always advocate for folks having a mastermind network of experts that they can talk with, and attorneys like Nicole that specialize in GovCon can really help you understand what you really need to do to be compliant. So, middleman strategy, is it doable? Yes. Is it easy? No, not necessarily, but it's possible. But you do need the education, and you do need, I think, the expert guidance to make sure that you're doing it in the right way. Or, best case scenario is they just reject your order. Worst case scenario is they have you go ahead and ship it and then tell you, hey, this is not labeled in the right way, and there's plenty of horror stories on that. And that's really all I've got. Michael, do you have any last words on that as well?
Yeah, I think you both summed it up really, really well. I think the education being big, I do think I really value having a team of experts around you. I think that is really, really important. And then I think the hardest part for most people when they're doing this is internally having a bid, no bid process. You know, it's don't look at everything with dollar signs, especially when you're starting off. Focus on a niche, focus on something you know, and understand it's going to take some time. And again, like you said, if you follow some of these guidelines, the odds are you're going to be way more successful than the people who just jump in. They're all over the map. They don't understand the products. They don't understand the services, and they're just, you know, trying to make dollars out of it. So really take your time with that.
Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap up on this episode of GovCon Coffee and Issues, but if you are online with us, hang out. We're going to be doing a Q&A. If you're watching us live on Facebook, video, YouTube, and you want to join the Q&A, if you go over to gavology.com/issues, you can join us over there. But with that, what we'll do is we'll say goodbye to you for now, for those of you who may be watching this on demand, and encourage you to join us on Gavology Nation if you have continuing questions about this. You can get there by going to www. Wow, I just forgot my own website. Gavology.com/issues. www.gavology.com/issues. I think I'm having issues with memory.
You're having issues.
That's a different episode. With that, thanks everyone. And now we're going to do some Q&A.